So we're up to the parentheses on page 30, which is really Lamed Zayin Gimel. At the very end of Lamed Zayin Gimel. Lashon Rambam. So we said, we finished last time that by the animals it says Lemino. Okay. And the angels are likened to animals in that sense. Because it says, Of ze Michael, Yofef ze Gabriel. But man is not that way, that he is more complex, that he has many midos. He doesn't have one mean.
Because they can only do one thing at a time?
So they're higher, yes. Are they from Olam Hato? No. They're higher than man. Lashon Rambam, B'Akdama Lefirush HaMishnayot, and says the Rambam in his commentary in the Mishnah, Kol minei ba'alei chayim ve'elonot, yesh lehem po'al echad bilvad, o shnei pe'alim. אבל האדם יעשה מעשים רבים משתנים זה מזה. It says animals have one simple behavior. Or two. What he means to say is they're all the same.
Kill it and eat it.
I said each one has a different way of killing it and eating it, or grazing and eating it. Each one has its own minhag. But they only have one or two things that they do. They're not complex. But by man, you'll find that men have different minhagim altogether. They have different ways of acting.
So what about these animals that they train to do clever things
like we said yesterday with Avshitz?
The dogs.
It's not their nature.
Can find dead bodies.
Right. It's not their nature. You can teach them, but if you don't force them into it, they revert back to their first nature. But man can adapt to new.
Teach them, the fact that you can teach them, but well.
Yeah, well, you can teach because it's not stupid. It's not a rock. It has some ability to. That's what we mean by domesticate. Domesticate is like to habituate, to give it different habits. So I don't know what the sheep was before it was domesticated. Maybe it was never domesticated. Maybe it was always the same.
There's a Rashi about how sheep went wild and they killed people, they put them to death and all sorts of stuff.
Where's this Rashi?
I think it's somewhere in the Chariot.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. טוב. והנה מלבד שיש לו מכל 10 ספירות, apart from the fact that man has all 10 faculties, all 10 sfirot, 3 intellectual and 7 emotional. What? Attributes. ספירות. אף גם זאת בכל מידה מהמידות בשכלים הוא כלול גם כן משאר המידות. The most important thing is inter-inclusion. That each sphera is also made up like a composite of all the other 10, of all the other 9. So each one is a composite of all the forces. So that's what we call inter-inclusion. Derech mashal. So derech mashal, one example, באכזריות שלו כלול רחמנות. That even though he's strict, he has mercy, he has compassion. How do we see this? כמו אבא מכה את בנו, like a father educating a son by hitting him. That's how they used to do it, right? שהכאה זו אכזריות היא. So hitting your child, that's, how do you say אכזרי? You're being mean. You're being
Cruelty.
That's cruel. And yet,
it says in Mishnah, spare the rod, spoil the child.
Right. And yet, but still it comes from a place of compassion, mercy, and love. Because the only reason he's striking him, or educating him, or being mechanech him, is because of his love and his care for him. So it's a complex feeling. But the animal, you'd say, even if the animal is, chewing its cub, I don't know what it does, teaching it not to go there, it's not doing it out of mercy. It's doing it out of instinct. There's no complexity there. The instinct is, I care for you for 3 months, and after 3 months, I don't know who you are. I don't care who you are. There's no such thing in people. I mean, you can get over the care and the love and so on when the child grows up and goes a different way, and you're not interested anymore in this and that. But nonetheless, still something remains. But by the animals, it's almost unheard of. In fact, it's the other way around. That once the child matures, especially among the mammals. What do I mean? And with the mammals, you see it, and it's surprising. So they have no problem with the mother giving birth to a child from the child. It's very common. There's a lioness. She may end up being in the pride of her son, and she becomes his wife. And that, by the way, is explained in Kabbalah, that is where the Arizal says that all the different interactions between the Partzufim happen. You don't see it in the human world. You don't see the Ima coming into her or being taken by Za. You don't see it in the human world. But that type of coupling exists in Kabbalah. So where do you see it? So you see it only in the world of animals.
Well, there was a time when you saw it, but like at the very beginning, when it was called Chesed, when there were very few human beings. So this one married his sister. So it does exist. And if it didn't exist, then the Torah wouldn't come and say you mustn't do it. Because if it didn't exist, then there wouldn't be a point of talking about it.
But again, the point is that the Torah outlawed it. So how can
They
the
outlawed
Arizal
it
say...
because it was possible, because it was...
True. So now the question becomes, why would the Arizal bring it back? I'm saying he's bringing it back because he's looking at the abstract state. Before, like you say, before the human nature decided that this was wrong. We can't do this. But the animal world never lost it. It still has it. Okay? So that's what it means, that they're not complex. Their feelings are not complex. They either love or they hate, but they can't love and hate together. It doesn't work.
It wasn't accepted with great joy and happiness.
Hmm?
It wasn't accepted with great joy and happiness. When Moshe Rabbeinu brought the Torah, they said, they cried about their families.
Right.
So it wasn't something instinctive and automatic that it was wrong.
Right. Well, there they said that there was a monetary loss, which is why they were so sad. Because the most natural thing for a person to want is that his sons marry his daughters, and that way the money stays in the family. And when you marry into a different family, and now the money's split.
Money is gone to someone else.
Yeah. And he says the same thing, Moshe Katuv, like you mentioned in Mishlei, Chosech shivto sonevno va'avo shicharo musar. That one who refrains from, educating is the wrong word, but from
beating, whipping.
Okay, but how would you say it? How do you say chinuch in English? There's no word, but still, lechanech mishu.
Guide them.
It's a discipline. Yeah. One who doesn't discipline his son hates him, and the one who loves him teaches him morals. He gives him a musar shmuz. And like we know from Sfiras HaOmer that we have all the inter-inclusion of the different midot. But not only is man a composite in and of himself, he's also, like we said, Naaseh Adam. He also includes all the other forms of creatures.
Why is man composed of domain? He eats chai. Where is the domain?
Where's the domain?
Yeah, in a man. The mineral.
Yeah, it's a domain.
It's growing. It's growing.
No, the skin has a follicle inside that's growing. This is dead already. I don't feel it. The follicle, the skin's alive, but whatever is outside the skin. But beyond that, I mean, today, how would you say, with our modern chemical understanding of man, there's 6 chemicals that make up, 99% of our bodies, and those are domain. Those are completely inanimate, right? So when you're looking at it from the chemical point of view, so there's a lot of, right, up until the level of DNA, probably nobody would say that there's anything alive. DNA and up, so they would say, those molecules are already alive in a certain sense. They have a metabolism, that they can do things. Not exactly metabolism, but something else.
Well, physicists don't believe in chemistry anyway, so that's okay.
What does that mean?
Physicists scorn chemistry.
They scorn it, but they don't believe in it. They just say, what's the point? Okay. So he's also here. He gives us example. Oh, no, here he says Sarot. He's looking at the skin. He says the skin, the hair. He says like you that it's growing. It's like a vegetable. So he doesn't give here the example of what the domim is, what the inanimate in man is. And in his psyche, he has the spiritual inanimate, vegetable, and animate. So the otiyot, the letters of thought, of speech, they're the inanimate. And the midos are growing like a vegetable, meaning the emotions are growing through a person's life. And then from that you can understand that the moichin are like the animal. Why? Why would you say? Because that's what we mentioned before when we were walking, that if you can project your thought somewhere else, it's like you moved from here to there. It's like you're there now. And your thought can take you to other places. That's why people read books, right? Because in the thinking, you suddenly you go somewhere else. You're able to go somewhere else. That's why in Mishlei it says that man is called the small world. You put the whole world in man. Man is the inter-inclusion of all the different forms of creatures. And all this is because man is made in the form above, called the supernal man, the higher man, which is a partzuf, again a persona. But again, in this case, the persona is not like in Greek tragedy, but like all the personas together, everything together. And partzuf, persona, means that the 10 sfirot are tied to one another. And each one includes the others. And in the Arizal, this is a big deal. It's called Nikuda, Sfira, Partzuf, 3 levels of development. Sfira means just one sfira. Nikuda means there's just a point. All the sfirot are actually made out of points. This has to do with the shattering of the vessels, and each one of the sparks, if you want, or pieces of the vessels that was taken by Hashem and put together is called the Nikuda. And so in the Malchus, there's 100 points that have to come together in this Sphira. It's this amount of points. And then you create the Sphira. The Sphira itself is like one aspect of it. So it's Malchus and Yesod and Hod and Netzach. Each one is something distinct. At that level, they're a little bit like the animals. They're one track. But then you get to the next level, which is Partzuf. And then Partzuf, all the 10 Sphirot, each one includes all the others.
So where is this? This is before the Tzimtzum?
Everything is after. There's nothing in the Arizal that we discuss unless I say that it's Chassidus. And then it's coming from the Arizal that wasn't taught to Rav Chaim Vital. Or at least that he didn't report that it was taught to him. Rav Chaim Vital starts from the Tzimtzum. There's nothing by him before the Tzimtzum. It doesn't exist. But we know what the Arizal said, and we also have a tradition. So those are different. Everything here is after. And basically what we're saying is that when Hashem created the world, he took from the shattered vessels, he took the pieces. Nikuda is like a piece, I guess you could say. It's like a piece, and he made a whole out of it. He put it together.
A W-H-O-L-E.
Right. And then that whole thing became a sphera. But then the spheres themselves had to learn to inter-include, to connect each one, to find how to connect with each one of the others. So before they found out how to do it, that's called the world of chaos. Okay. And then Hashem put the sphirot back together again from the pieces. But this time they learned how to inter-include. And that's called a Partzuf. So in our world, he says they're all Partzufim. And again, when he says our world, it doesn't mean that people don't walk around without an ability to interconnect. Of course they do. When they're younger. Being an adolescent is being in the world of Tohu. So you have to have one idea. It's also why it's so difficult for young people who are not mature to be married. Because you can't see the other person in you. What you see is somebody who's against you, who thinks differently than you. You can't find the yourself in the other person, or the other person in yourself. So if you would get married when you were 11, it wouldn't work well. There'd be no connection. Try to imagine two 11-year-olds.
Fairly recently, people did get married at 14.
Apparently, it works if you're with your parents, to some extent. It's like you're raising two kids, and you have to solve the fights between them like you solve fights with your children, in the same way. And they slowly learn to live together. But it doesn't mean that they were mature enough to do it themselves. Unless it were very, once in a while there's a very mature child that's able to. But in general, it wasn't a very common thing for a child to be able, at age 13, 14, to really be able to connect to someone else. They couldn't really do it. We have trouble doing it at age, 50, 60. So if we still have trouble at 50, 60, certainly at age 13 we don't have the capacity to do it. But at least when you're older, then you begin to understand that the other person is not a different world. But what they feel are things that you feel also. You begin to find their feelings in yourself. You begin to find your feelings in them. There's a lot more identification. So that's called inter-inclusion. That's a state of tikkun. That's a state of rectification.
So Gaffney always tells us to make a shidduch with a young Sfadi, because they're easier to train.
So, if you want trained animals, I guess that's what you do. I'm sure he didn't mean it that way.
Huh?
I'm sure he didn't mean it that way.
Well, he said it with a smile.
And so here there's a note. Where does it talk about Nikuda Sfira Partzuf? That's called Shar Kaftet, Shar Partzufim, Perek Zayin, in the Eitz Chaim. That's where the Rav Chaim Vital talks about this development from a point to a Sfira to a Partzuf. And he writes, Ki Nikuda hu Asiyah sheba Sfira. When there's a point, it's like the Sfira is only in the world of Asiyah. It's only world of action. Usfira ubchinat asfira shleima me'ab yasheba. But when you have all four worlds together, that's called the Sfira. Upartzuf hu kesher 10 sfirot, v'chol sfira mehem shleima me'ab yad kan neshama. But the Partzuf is having all 10 sfirot together in each Sfira, and then it's called a Partzuf.
How many Partzufim are there?
In general, there's 12. But that's not the same thing exactly as saying a Sfira. גם יש בפרצוף בחינת מוחין חב"ד. So all this was true about, in general, that all the Partzufim, when you rise to the level of talking about Partzufim, in other words, when you first learn Kabbalah, you learn the simple language. The simple language is that there's 10 Sfirot. And so you learn the names of 10 Sfirot, you try to define them, you try to understand them, and then you start picking stuff apart, trying to analyze it using this model. But as you progress in learning, you don't really talk about Sfirot anymore. You talk about Partzufim. Why? Because it's a higher level of, it's a higher terminology. And this higher terminology allows a lot more relationship between different things. So for instance, at some point I'm going to have to speak about it, about the development of taking a pasuk and looking at the different commentaries. So you have a pasuk, and one Rashi says this, the Ramban says this, the Ibn Ezra says this, the Sforno says this, the Malbim says this, and so on. You have a plethora of different commentaries, each one with possibly a very different direction. most of them are based on the sages. So it means that the sages themselves understood this verse in 10 different ways, or 70 different ways, or who knows how many different ways. So some people look at that and they're taken aback, and they're like, so what's the truth? The answer is they're all true. These are all different correct perspectives from that verse. So how do you put it together? So most people have a daunting task, which is really unachievable, which is that they're going to have to navigate the whole world of commentaries and ideas. They're going to have to decide on each verse, on each thing each issue, who they're going to follow. And since they know this principle called Asel Harav, you're supposed to have one shita, so it becomes even worse, and they feel that they're lying to themselves, because it's true that in general I follow Rashi, but in this particular case the Ramban makes a lot more sense to me. So what do I do? So that's only possible if that's only a problem if you don't have Potzufim. If you see each commentary is sitting alone by itself, if you don't see how they complement one another. But if you think about Potzufim, then all the commentaries that you find, they sit together in a whole. Each one is a different facet of that verse. The verse is the whole. The verse contains everything. And the commentaries take it apart. They're not trying to say, this is how you should see it, and if you see it any other way, you're mistaken. There's no, even when I disagree, even when the Ibn Ezra calls Rashi names, or the Ramban doesn't like what the Rashi is saying, he didn't come to say that he was wrong. He came to say that I have a different perspective. And my perspective is just as valid, because that perspective is only so good. They're saying it's wrong in the sense that it's not universal. It's not the be-all, where-all of everything. You can't judge you can't understand a verse using just Rashi. There's other aspects to it. And I'll show you a different aspect. So the moment you understand that, you've matured to the next stage of learning Torah. The same thing happens in Kabbalah, when you're learning Kabbalah. That first you talk about Sfirot. The truth is, in the beginning, all you talk about is the Sfirah in the world of Asiya, like the Nikuda of the Sfirah. Nikuda is like saying, somebody tells you, loving kindness is, they say something like, an act of kindness. That's loving kindness. Or they say, it's your right arm. That's a Nikuda. It's not even, why? Because your right arm, you use it in the world of action. You didn't even mean it at the level of formation. What is this? What does your right arm really represent in terms of emotion? You just mean it. So the first example people get of Sfirot is some kind of action, some kind of something that depicts that Sfirah, which is the same way that you would teach language to a child. You teach it exactly the same way, right? At first you don't say bus is the general concept of a bus, and you know, you're learning English, and then so in the beginning the bus is just a school bus or something like that you're aware of. But then slowly the bus becomes a lot more. Like for instance in computers, the bus is what transfers data along like a pipeline that distributes it to everything. You have all kinds of meanings to these words. They're much more complex than just they're multifaceted, which by the way is a problem with English, because English is childish thinking in the sense that it never matures to have the multifaceted picture, because instead of one word being multifaceted, they break off the meanings. So there is benefit to that in that you're more exact and precise when you're expressing yourself, but there's also, in terms of the development of the mind is used to everything having its own spot. It's like it's very rudimentary understanding in the end. If everything has its own word, if every shade of a feeling has a different word, it's good for definitions, but it doesn't create a very complex person. And so the mind in the end is learning more information, but having maybe less depth of experience also. So the same thing happens in the Sfirot. In the beginning you just say to somebody, oh, loving kindness, chesed, That's so and so. Then you come to the verse that we just read in last week's parsha, and you already mentioned it twice today. That incest is called chesed. Why is it called chesed? Why is this chesed? So you have to redefine your understanding of chesed. Wait a minute. It's not. Why is it loving kindness to be with your sister? What's going on here? So you have to understand, and then you come to a better definition, which is more inclusive of all the different aspects of chesed, which is that chesed is extension without limits. You're extending without any limits. There's no limits on your extension. You just go wherever you want. And then you understand why water is called chesed. Because water has no limits. It extends. It just flows down.
I never heard water called this.
And it will take any shape that you put it into, because it's a liquid.
I never heard water being defined as chesed. I understand water was instability.
No. Water is chesed. That's Michael Sar Shel Mayim. We just read it. And Gavriel is fire, and he's Gvura. So why is fire Gvura? What's going on? Because it breaks things up. It consumes them. Breaking it up is not the main thing. It consumes it. And Gvura is something that consumes. So as you move forward, as you keep learning, you understand that, again, this is how Kabbalah developed. In the beginning, they were talking only about Sfirot. So when the early Kabbalists read the Zohar, all they knew about was Sfirot. They didn't talk about Partzufim. And then the Arizal came and said, no, you don't understand what the Medrash, what the Zohar is saying. The Zohar has a very complex message here. And the only way you can understand it is by using the language, the terminology of Partzufim. You're not going to understand it with the terminology of just Sfirot. The Zohar doesn't say either. It doesn't say it's talking about Sfirot. It doesn't say it's talking about Partzufim. It just talks. And depending on your level of understanding, how much you've evolved, then you understand the Zohar in different ways. It could be, by the way, that the early Kabbalists, like the Ramban, that they understood. Somebody will tell me the Ramban didn't see the Zohar. But it's clear that he did, because he has passages of the Zohar in his commentary. But it could be that the Ramban himself understood a much more complex picture, but the language that was being used at the time wasn't able to depict it. So he uses, in the end, a simple spherotic language, which he doesn't even call Sfirot exactly, but he does. He uses it to some extent. But when the Arizal came along 300 years later, almost 400 years later, after the Ramban, so there was already a maturity that he could begin to speak in a language that was much more complex, that read the Zohar in a much more complex way. גם יש בפרצוף בחינת מוחין חב"ד אשר באו בשינויים, לפעמים בחינת גדלות, פעם קטנות. The other thing is that not only are there emotions, there's also intellect. And the intellect, the three sfirot of the intellect, Chochmah, Bina, and Das, they have different states. They go through different states. 2 states of small-mindedness and 2 states of great-mindedness. Gadlut, sometimes it's this, and sometimes it's that. So they themselves are in different states. So within the Partzuf, which is already very complex, you also have that some of the intellect can be in different states. ומחמת כי בצלם אלוקים נעשה האדם שלמטה גם כן, לכן יש בו כל בחינות הנ"ל. And because man was created in this image, so therefore even man down here, the physical man that we know, has all these aspects to him. גם בחינת פנימית וחיצוניות. He also has the inner and external aspects to him, which is the biggest issue. Here he doesn't get into it. But just the fact that we say that something has an inner meaning and an external meaning, saying that there's 2 dimensions at least of explanation for what is going on. And there's nothing like that in other creatures. There's no 2 levels of explanation. Not naturally, anyway. when the when the animal does what it does, there's no hidden agenda. And if you're ascribing to it a hidden agenda, you say, oh, this dog is mean. So you're ascribing meanness to it. You can't understand that. It's just the way it is. It's not, it doesn't have an inner world in which it's thinking about, oh, should I do it this way or that way? It's all instinctual. Mm-hmm. There's no inner representation of anything. So only man has this ability, this quality of having an inner and external experience. And again,
it's consequences more than anything else. No?
That's one of the things that you can imagine internally, and then you can understand how to act externally based on what you just imagined. There's an inner representation of what you feel. But again, I would say more like motives. Like, what's your real motive? So you find this thing that you can sit in a psychiatrist's office or a psychologist's office, and you can find an infinite levels of deeper meaning of what you've done, of what you've experienced. So you don't really know in the end what your motivation was. Sometimes you're not even aware of the different levels. So even the inner representation is not always so clear. It's not always conscious. But it exists. But man was this is what it means, that he was created, and the man was created in God's image, which is like being created in the image of the supernal man. It says even in the Merkava, in Ezekiel's chariot, he says all of the animals that were carrying the chariot, each one had the face of a human. It's very inter-included, everything there. This eagle had one side that looked like a human. So it's an eagle-human face. What's it saying? It's saying what the Egyptians and all the idolaters tried to represent using statues. You make a mishmash, you put a sphinx. So it's like a lion with a person's head. So the lion, it's basically the Merkava. They have the same idea. The problem is that for them it was very concrete. They didn't treat it as something spiritual. But in Ezekiel, it's a spiritual vision. That's what it is, and that's how it's treated.
Where did the Egyptians get this idea from?
Huh?
Where did the Egyptians get this idea from?
You don't need to go very far. It's in you. Because we liken people. The moment you say that he's as brave as a lion, what you just did is, without knowing it, I don't know how the ancient mindset 3,000 years ago would interpret this statement. But the moment you use this metaphor, he's as brave as a lion, you've set yourself up to combine the two pictures together. It's very hard not to. So why do we use metaphor? That's one of the big questions in the philosophy of language. Why can't we just say he's brave? Why does he have to be like something? That metaphoric stance of the mind, why it has to liken something to something else. So we know, as Jews, we know why we have it, because the soul is constantly trying to liken Hashem to something. It's constantly trying to grasp that which is ungraspable. So the only way you can do that is through a metaphor. So that's the root reason why we draw these metaphors all the time, because we're trying to grasp the ungraspable. That's ingrained into the human soul. It's trying to liken it to something else. In any case, so this causes us to say that the chariot itself is very complex. Really, it's an example of inter-inclusion. Because of that, in the end, in the Kabbalah, it's accepted there were 256 angels that he saw. Why 256? Because they have four, and each one has four faces. So you don't say that each one had four faces. The explanation is that the four faces, each one had 4 faces. And then it's 4 to the 4th, which is 256. Right? Because 4 to the 2nd is 16, and 4 to the 3rd is 64, and 4 to the 4th is 256. Why is that interesting? There was I don't know, I'm trying to figure out what happened with these 2 experiments that are rocking the world of quantum mechanics. I don't understand what they are yet. I didn't have time to try to understand in layman's terms what happened. But before these experiments, it just happened a month ago. The biggest problem in the quantum world was what's the relationship between the different particles? There's so many of them. They called it the particles. Is there any kind of organizing principle for everything that we found? And so one of the interesting organizing principles that was suggested was to use a Lie group, which is a type of mathematical construct that has 256 elements to it. So that's about the number of particles, and it leaves space for some things that have not been discovered. And it sort of said, this has to exist, this has to exist. So that was a very interesting correlation between the idea that in Kabbalah appears that the Merkava had 256 angels, really. And each angel is like a particle. It represents a particle. Okay? In any case. ועל כן נאמר באדם וירדו בדגת הים ובעוף השמיים שכמו שאדם דלעיל על דמות הכיסא דמות כמר אדם עליו מלמעלה משה לו כל 4 חיות במרכבה הכוללים כל החיות פרטיים כך האדם לפי שנעשה בצלם אלוקים וכולל גם כן הבחינות דומה וצומח חי לכן הוא מושל ורודה בכולם. So that's why it says after man was created or the purpose of man being created is that he will rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, because like the form of the man that's seen on the Merkava, on the chariot, man too is supposed to guide, he's supposed to be the driver of his chariot. And what's his chariot? All of reality. And he was constructed from all of reality, as it were. He inter-includes all of reality in him.
The man's face also has 4 faces? Or only 1?
That's a good question. Usually, I think we mentioned this in the Zohar, Chokhmat HaPartzuf is seeing, first of all, which animal of the Merkava you are. Meaning that when somebody looks at you, the first thing that he'll look for is, what do you look like? Do you look like a lion? Do you look like a human? Like a eagle? Like a lion? Like a ox? Which one is it? Since it's a human face, there's nuances. So then he would say, he looks like the lion in the eagle. But really, we're all the lion in the man, the eagle in the man, because most people don't have a face that really looks like an animal. There are exceptions.
It's interesting because in the colors, my wife also divides the whole world up into 4. Spring, summer, winter,
Mm-hmm. That's just another way of doing this. By the way, I wanted to give her the Gemara that vindicates her whole Shita.
Oh, yeah?
It's about Rabban Gamliel.
Which Gemara?
How does when Rabban Gamliel met Reish Lakish?
Which Gemara?
It's in Shabbos, no? When they met.
When you couldn't jump over the river coming back. Yeah.
I don't remember where it is. Maybe it's in Shabbos? I don't remember where it is. Probably not in Shabbos. No, it's Baba Mitzia Pei Zayin.
We gave him his sister.
Right. So his beauty is described. How beautiful was he? It says Rabban Gamliel. Rabbi Yochanan. Sorry, I don't know why I said Rabbi. So he says he was like, if you take a silver goblet and you fill it with pomegranates and you put it on the border between the shadow and the sun, as you know, there's places where the shadow, there's a limit where the sun's rays reach. That's the beauty. So what do you see? You see her colors. You have the white of the silver, the red of the pomegranate, and then the yellow of the sun or the light, and then the darkness of the shadow, or light, or the gray in the.
So they had all four attributes in one
Right.
go.
And that's how they describe his beauty. It's a very interesting way to describe beauty. And it reminded me that she once told us that won't mention his name, because I saw this whole question about whether mentioning non-Jewish people's names or not when you're learning. But anyway, there's this famous actor who she says his face is like a winter scene. You probably heard it. You don't have to say his name.
No, I have no idea.
Okay. So the description she gave
this
was very similar in that sense. So anyway, show her that Gemara.
Bli neder, Bezrat Hashem.
So we'll see you tomorrow.
Tomorrow is an interesting day. Tomorrow is Lag BaOmer.
It's the best day to learn.
And I'm taking the children out on the Ta'alucha. I'm the head driver. I have to meet every year for the last 25 years.
Really? I didn't see you there.
Someone has to be a first car. Nobody's allowed to cross the first car. So the children will march in a circle.
With Sonnenfeld?
Yeah.